I'm leading us into the approaches to humanism and co-op governance from the theoretical perspectives. And much as we love doing theory, I want to stress that it's really important. It's not just for fun. It's an important influencer of economic theory, management theories, and therefore also systems that are being developed. So I think this is really important work that we can share today. And it's my very great pleasure to start us off with Silvia Sacchetti and Ermanno Tortia, who are coming to us from Italy. They're at the University of Trento at EURICSE, the European Institute that is doing amazing work in all things cooperatives and is very familiar to us. So I believe Silvia will be speaking first, and Ermanno is away for this session, but he will be joining us later. Silvia, are you ready?
Thank you. Thank you,
Hi,
Sonja.
good to see you. So go ahead.
Good to see you all. I understand I have about 15 minutes, Sonja, yeah?
You have 15 minutes and you can share your screen if you have PowerPoints.
I do indeed. And it should also move up and down. Yes. Thank you very much, and good evening or afternoon to everyone. This is, as Sonja was saying, a joint research, theoretical research that I have developed with Ermanno Tortia at the University of Trento. And it starts out of our research on governance and on the governance of cooperatives. But in fact, in this particular talk, I'm going to address governance in general, not just about cooperatives. And the idea is...
Silvia, sorry to interrupt you. Are you thinking you're sharing PowerPoints or not? Because we are not seeing them.
Oh, you're not seeing it? Okay,
no.
Yes, I was thinking to share it. Okay. Can you see it now?
Something's coming. Yes, excellent. Thank you.
Excellent. So I didn't go beyond the title, so never mind. Okay. Our question is, in fact, exactly related to what Sonja said earlier in the introduction to this workshop. We're asking how governance could actually change if we placed a human perspective at the center as the objective instead of efficiency as in the mainstream theory of the firm and transaction cost and agency theory. So in fact, because we start from a humanistic approach, we also start from one of the basic, the founding ideas in psychology, which is Maslow's idea of self-actualization. And of course, this is not moving now, but it's not moving down.
Sorry, Silvia, try clicking on it twice.
Click twice. Yes.
Okay.
Excellent. Thank you. Wisdom. So we start from Maslow, and in fact, not from his most known work, in fact, but we come out of his work on management, one of the last works that he published, and in particular the Sacchetti management book that he wrote in '65. And in that book, to make a long story short, he actually identified two big areas of what make people feel well or self-actualized. And so he identifies what in organizations people seek in an active way, positively, and what they seek is to make decisions. They see for autonomy in their job, for initiative, for acknowledgement of their competence and capabilities. It's what we call now, coming out of self-determination theory, self-actualizing forces, in fact. But he also identifies regressive forces, an whole set of regressive regressive forces, or in other words, what people try to avoid. And they try to avoid, as we know well, after so many years, they try to avoid to be determined, exploited, forced into situations, disrespected, and considered as interchangeable. Now, why people behave in that way? Well, in the first case, because they seek to actually grow as people, they seek for their self-actualization. In the second case, they try to avoid all those situations because they don't want to regress as individuals. So they would tend to protect themselves from all these negative stimuli. And this is what happens at the individual level, and of course this has also effects on organizations, as we know. So out of this analysis in organizational psychology, the question we reflect upon is really to what extent governance solutions contribute to the promotion of self-actualizing forces, right? So we, in fact, identify building on previous research, theoretical research, two extremes, inclusive governance structures and processes on the one hand, and exclusive governance structures on the other hand. And you see in this diagram, actually, that we have depicted a positive relationship between self-actualization and inclusive governance, so that as inclusion, the features of governance that embody inclusion and stakeholders increase in quality and effectiveness. Actually, also self-actualization goes up, and vice versa. If we have exclusive forms of governance, then we would have regressive forces at play, and therefore lower self-actualization. And in this diagram, you see that at the bottom, I have included the features of exclusive governance, and in the top part, we have the features of inclusive governance. So the crucial difference, as you can see, is that the problem of exclusion, of course, is that is of concentrated control and in decision-making bodies, and the coordination mechanisms that are especially used are authority and contracts that are oriented towards a need, let's say, to reduce the risk of opportunism. So this is mostly the solution that through hierarchy, conventional hierarchy, and exclusive rights to control is reflected in conventional corporations. In the top part, you have the features of inclusive governance, where the main feature is shared control, yeah, and self-defined rules. And as coordination mechanisms, cooperation takes the lead, although that, of course, does not include that authority. I mean, a hierarchy is present, and contracts are used as well. But the crucial point here is that individuals are considered as trustworthy individuals who are mostly willing to commit to what they do and to the project of the organization which they contribute to define, while in the exclusive governance form, the assumption is that individuals would defect if they can. Of course, that doesn't mean that individuals are necessarily behaving opportunistically. It means, as an assumption in transaction cost theory, for example, that there is a very high risk of opportunism. So the line of reasoning goes in this way, more or less. So we start from the assumptions about individual needs and behaviors. If we start from a humanistic approach from Maslow, in fact, there is no reason to assume that individuals mean wrong in their acts. We might as well assume that they mean well. And if we assume that individuals mean well, of course, until the opposite is proven, then how can we design governance? Because the current governance system is centered around the idea that individuals do not mean well. So it's essentially based around coordination mechanisms that use authority and incentives that are essentially monetary incentives on performance, which are present also in other type of solutions, but in a different way, because in fact the entire governance structure, if yes, the idea of this paper is that if we start from the assumption that individuals are well meant, the entire governance structure can change towards self-actualization rather than using regressive forces. So what we have done here is to reformulate a theory of governance that is based on self-determination and needs theory. So we call it needs theory of governance, and we compare it with organizational economics and the component of this mainstream theory. And some elements overlap, in fact, but not too many. So the main thesis, as I said, is that in this theory is that self-actualization at work is an outcome of governance, while in organizational economics, efficiency is an outcome of governance. So the objective is different as well. I'm going rather quick because of the time, but the units of analysis in this theory are individuals within organizations. Well, the idea is that the dichotomy between the individual aims and motives and the organizational aims and motives is not always appropriate. That in fact, perhaps is a false dichotomy when we apply cooperation as a coordination mechanism. While in organizational economics is in the first place, the units of analysis are organizations, and that relation with individuals comes through the need to reduce risk of opportunism and maximize efficiency, so to align individual and organizational objectives. The two theories differ also in terms of individual needs and behavioral assumptions. So in needs theory, the idea is that we have individuals with multiple and evolving needs, while in organizational economics, needs are essentially translated into monetary needs and related to self-interest only, while other regarding preferences are considered not important. The other feature of behavioral assumptions, as I mentioned, is that in this theory is that individuals are trustworthy and well-meant until, of course, the actual facts prove the opposite, and therefore different measures are needed. Another element of the theory that we have isolated are rules and incentives. So again, in this theory, rules are conceived to enable self-actualization and self-actualizing forces. So we talk about inclusive governance bodies, multi-stakeholdership, participation, deliberative practices, and an emphasis on participatory processes in general. The other element is that these rules are obviously not defined exclusively, but they are self-defined alongside what Ostrom has suggested repeatedly. Of course, still individuals respond to incentives, but essentially individuals are thought as trustworthy, and therefore rewards and punishments are also sort of used with respect to that type of individual. Organizational economics has a different take on this issue, and essentially in terms of having rules that tend to activate regressive forces, because we talk about exclusive governance bodies, constrain and control on potential defectors, and a very big emphasis on rules with a function of punishment, especially in a context of contract incompleteness. So overall, this theory that we suggest, the NIST theory, has as independent variable the inclusivity of governance. The idea is that it is inclusivity that has an impact on self-actualization of people, and that this line of causality is moderated by effective behavior, and that explains when I talk about individuals being trustworthy and rules and structures actually reflecting that assumption. I also include in the reasoning the fact that this needs to be adjusted alongside observed behaviors. Okay. Yes. To finalize, actually, we have also disentangled all the differences between NIST theory and organizational economics with respect to the organizational objective, with respect to the attitude towards empowerment of people in the two different governance theories, where of course empowerment is not important or not to be trusted for organizational economics, while it's very central in NIST theory, and the prevalent coordination method, which is the deliberative practice in NIST theory and based on authority and contracts in organizational economics, and that reflects the insights of agency theory in particular. So the idea of, the paper goes on by suggesting a number of propositions besides these key assumptions, but I think that, jumping to conclusion and the so what question, of course, that it's a theoretical contribution needs to face. Ermanno and I actually think that the importance of this approach is, in fact, to encourage management in particular to rethink governance and the processes that actually feature within their structures, asking themselves the question on how they can in fact move towards the self-actualization of people rather than only economic efficiency, and that I must say is not very often associated to governance issue. So we thought that this could be the actual value of an approach that suggest a different take on governance, starting from different assumptions about individuals and giving a different aim to the organization, which is not just efficiency, but actually the well-being of people. And I think I've used all my minutes, Sonja.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you so much, Silvia. Okay, we'll move on through this section because we do have a discussant in this section, not in every one, but this particular one does have a discussant who is going to pull it all together for us. So I'll move us into the social capital theory. This is Eklou, Amendah, and Christina Clamp. And thank you for being here. Great to see you. So I don't know, Eklou and Chris, how you will divide your presentations. Feel free to share your slides and let us know how it'll work.
Okay.
And you do have 15 minutes, you know that.
Yeah, I know. Now, if I can just see my screen to get the screen to move as slides. There we go. No, okay. Eklou, I'm in trouble here because I can't see the buttons.
Chris, if you look at the bottom right.
Yeah, no, it was just covered up by the Zoom screen. Sorry, everyone. And I'll try not to. Eklou, why don't you start by just sharing some little while I fix the screen.
Oh, okay. I thought you wanted me to take over the sharing the screen.
Unfortunately, I've got all my notes visible and I'm having trouble figuring out how to get to the right screen.
All right, so while you're doing that, Chris, I'm going to go ahead and introduce myself.
Yeah, please.
My full name is Eklou Romeric Amendah. I'm a professor of marketing in the School of Business. I taught previously marketing at Southern New Hampshire University, where Chris is at for 12 years, specifically marketing research and retailing courses. I recently joined the University of Southern Maine in Portland, Maine, the School of Business, where I'm pretty much teaching the same thing, marketing research, consumer behavior, and retailing, managerial marketing, etc. Chris and I embark in this journey together with our good friend, Carol Corrin. I think Carol is on the call as well, on this journey of studying shared services cooperative for many, many years now. And that turned into a book that we published, I believe, in 2019, if I get the year right. And today we want to share with you a little bit of about the governance structure when it comes to shared services and tie that to social capital. Thank you for having us.
Okay, so in terms of what we're presenting today, we are revisiting the theories of social capital and governance in regard to how useful this is as a framework for analyzing issues of governance in shared services cooperatives. And by way of phone interviews, we were able to speak with the directors of these three cooperatives: Family Child Care Coalition, Community Purchasing Alliance, and the Back Office Cooperative. So when we talk about these cooperatives, what we're talking about are cooperatives where the members are other organizations as opposed to individuals. And obviously, this can create some interesting dynamics in terms of how to manage the individual interests of each of the organizations as they work together to meet their shared interests. And so key to this discussion, as we've formulated, is understanding the way that social capital can contribute to building a successful cooperative. Right, so we started by going back to looking at the literature on nonprofit collaboration, which is a fairly extensive literature. And very often in shared services, people are coming together to collaborate around administrative needs or to address issues such as aggregating purchasing to lower their operating costs. Banat, who's at Swarthmore participated in a seminar, and he summarized very succinctly these challenges that happen in nonprofit collaboration. First being the free rider, secondly, short-term bias as opposed to taking a long-term view on the collaboration. Endowment effect, which is where one member of the collaboration may consider their contribution as being more valuable than that of others. Overconfidence in the ability to achieve goals through the collaboration. Resistance to change when it entails the group having to make changes in their behavior in order to successfully work together. And then lastly, discrepancies in shared norms. So when we talk about social capital, I think the theoretical framework on social capital speaks very well to this issue. And it's one that talks about the ways in which we build trust and the role of norms in building that trust. So in our research on shared services cooperatives, what we've noted is that there's occasions where a group gets started and they decide that everybody has to use all the services created by the shared services cooperative. And in the cases that we've analyzed, both with the specifics to nonprofits as well as more generically, what we found is that what works best is where the cooperative seeks to provide the support that's needed for the members. So paying attention to what the members need, as opposed to trying to address the overall menu of services that could be provided, and to come up with strategies that ensures that at the end of the day, the members see the cooperative as we, rather than something that gets exploited for self-interest or the individual cooperative members' needs. So the challenge is how to create shared needs and norms of mutual aid and reciprocity, which, as we've gone through the literature on cooperatives and social capital, it's very clear that the cooperative model is a good one for being able to further that agenda. We also noted that Granovetter's classic work on social networks and weak ties is also relevant to our analysis here. So when we talk about cooperatives and nonprofits in the social economy, we've found that cooperatives are useful because they bring together norms of transparency, shared governance, and an equitable sharing of benefits. That this enables them to be able to address the fact that many times nonprofits in these cooperatives are serving a social purpose with disadvantaged groups in the community, and that there's also an overlap or a gray blurring in the model between mutual nonprofits and nonprofit cooperatives, in that often instead of having joining fees, they will look to membership fees on an annual basis and voluntary participation. So I'm going to pass this on to Eklou at this point, and then we can come back to a more deeper discussion of the specific cases. Eklou?
Thank you very much, Chris. In the data gathering process, when we were conducting this study, we interviewed 3 executive directors, of course, with 3 separate organizations: CPA, Community Purchasing Alliance out of Washington, D.C., BOC, Back Office Cooperative from Chicago, and FCC, Family Childcare Coalition from Philadelphia. And it was clear in the interview that these 3 organizations adopted 3 separate governance model. It was also clear that 2 of them are doing fine, they're doing okay, BOC and CPA. And the third one, FCC, as if I can use these terms, in infancy, in terms of the governance model. And it was also clear that the success and the struggle are linked to the governance model that they they adopted. It was at this point in time in the presentation, we would like to share with you a little bit about the governance structure in a typical cooperative, talk about its limitation theoretically, but share with you about the results of our content analysis based on the interview data that we have. And my colleague Chris is going to wrap it up with some of the key findings. So I think we all agree that the foundation of the governance model in a cooperative is the internal governance structure. And this internal governance structure has absolutely nothing to do with the corporate model. The corporate model is profit-driven, right? Where you have a clear separation between ownership and management, and where owners cede management right to staff and agent, etc. That's not what we're seeing in a typical cooperative governance model. In a governance model in cooperative, it's predicated on this democratic principle that Sonja talked about this morning: one member, one vote. Also guided by its mission, which is to provide services to its members. So we can fairly say that the social and economic justification of any cooperative existence, at least at the governance level, is to make sure that members work for members to provide certain services that would help them be successful. Now, having said that, in terms of its typical structure, you'll see the General Assembly, the Board of Directors, and in some situations, the Supervisory Board. And the role of the Supervisory Board is to monitor, so to speak, the activities of the Board of Directors. Now, some scholars have suggested that in some organizations, for a governance model to be successful, there should be this duality of control and collaboration that Sonja actually talked about this morning. And control gives to employees this flexibility and discipline in terms of the daily tasks, and collaboration gives them this empowerment to implement their activity. But control and collaboration, that model is, so to speak, against the spirit of the cooperative model. And yet that's what some scholars actually suggested. But in the literature, Chris, if you could go to the next slide, please. In the literature, there are some suggestions in terms of how to address the governance issue at the cooperative, in a cooperative, right? Appointment, some suggested the appointment of professional managers, some suggested new voting system proportional to the transactions done by each member. Some even suggested to invite external member into the board of directors. Some suggested the clear separation between the cooperative association and the cooperative firm to limit the legal exposure of the cooperative, and some suggested this hybrid ownership model. But one of the suggestions, one of the solutions that actually had widespread attention in the literature among scholars is that of Woods. So Chris, if you could go to the next one, please. Woods actually came up with what he called the cyclical model in terms of 4 separate stages: the founding phase, the supermanaging phase, the corporate phase, and the ratifying phase. It's very important to mention, though, that the premise for Woods' proposal here is that, and he clearly mentioned it in his paper, that board of directors are, so to speak, the guarantors of members' rights, and they should act like it. So in the founding phase, board of director members have to be involved in the activities of the cooperative, highly involved in the activity of the cooperative. In case of crisis, when crisis hit, they should move, the board members should move to micromanage the cooperative. And when the crises are actually kept under control, they should move into this corporate phase role, where they play the role of oversight, and later on move to ratifying phase, where they listen to recommendations from the management team. Please go to the next slide, Chris. Now, there are some issues, of course, in the governance model when cooperatives in this organization are under the shared services model. It's very important to mention that some of the factors that contribute to the success of a governance model in shared services are the open membership, voluntary participation, independence and interdependence of its members, and members' cooperations. But there are some uncontrollable factors coming from the external business environments, and these factors could be competition, increase in management costs, marketing, services, purchasing, procurement, etc., that push some cooperatives to deviate, so to speak, from the typical governance model that we know for cooperatives. So what we did, Chris, if you can go to the next slide, we actually talked to these 3 executive directors to understand their their governance model, because they all operate under that shared services model. So CPA out of Washington, DC, help churches purchase in areas such as solar, electricity, trash hauling, etc. And back office out of Chicago provides to its members basically consulting services, expense management service and procurement. FCC out of Philadelphia provide mentorship and PD, professional development. So in the content analysis that we conducted, under the 4 factors, the 4 important factors that to a certain degree define social capital: propinquity, nature of the network, whether it's dense or weak, trust, which is at the center of the social capital notion, and the orientation, whether it's internal or external, and we expect this orientation to be very much internal in other cases, and it was internal for CPA and FCC, but strangely external for BOC. Trust is pretty much represented if you can please go back,
sure,
Chris. Trust is represented in all 3, and in terms of propinquity is also represented in present in all 3 organizations. The network is dense for CPA and BOC, but emerging for FCC. Again, FCC governance model is not fully fleshed. And my colleague Chris is going to provide a little more context to this result later on. But in terms of the co-op dimensions, Chris, if you can please go to the next slide. Marketing, purchasing, shared staffing, professional development. Purchasing and shared staffing are represented in all 3 organizations that we talked to. But FCC also has marketing and professional development. And on the far right, you can see some of the specific activities that these organizations actually engage in. What we also did in the analysis stage is to see where these organizations are in terms of the Wood classification. So CPA is in the ratifying phase. BOC is at the intersection of super managing and corporate phase, and FCC is in the founding phase. So I'm going to let Chris talk.
Yeah, I have to barge in. I'm sorry, Chris. You have about 30 seconds.
Yeah. So let me just go to this last slide, and I realize we're running over. Sorry. What we found with the research is that in the case of the DC group, they had a board of people who came out of the church groups originally, people with probably some good experience of serving on boards, and also had a community organizer who had good relationship skills that has really helped them to move the co-op forward. What we also noted there is that to the extent there was a tension between the board and the executive director, it would come up around big issues. And one of the bigger issues was that he had moved to North Carolina, and they needed to to identify a local director for the DC operations. But in the end, they've been able to work it out. Both BOC and CPA had started with some services that they later realized were not financially sustainable and have had to come up with different strategies going forward for how to address identification of what services would be provided to members. BOC also had an issue that they originally started by requiring everybody to buy everything and realized that that inhibited their ability to attract new members. They also because of that, had flattened on their membership, ran into some financial trouble, and ultimately created a second class of members that are non-voting and cannot serve on the board. And by doing that, they were able to go from 34 members to 125 members and to shift their sales volume from 3 million to over 10 million. FCC is really interesting because it is a group that is focused on serving the daycare providers within the African American community, or essentially the communities of color in Philadelphia. And so the challenge for them is in developing the cooperative to be able to attract members during the development phase where there's pressure to participate in the startup process. And for owners of their own daycare centers, it can be a factor that represents a barrier to joining. But they have 3 very dedicated founding members who are using the platform of the co-op to also do professional development training to serve both members and non-members. And the non-members, of course, are a revenue stream for them. Sorry for running over, but that's a short synopsis.
All right, thank you so much. Yeah, and I'm sorry, it's always like this when you try to say a lot of things in 15 minutes. So apologies to you as well, but we had to squish it because there's so much to talk about. So I'm hoping we're having something from you that can be shared, a paper or even the presentation, I think will be helpful to share with participants, right?
Sure.
Yeah, but if any, whatever papers come through, we'll.
Yeah, the paper we after having putting the presentation together, we decided we wanted to go back and do more work on the paper.
All right, so we'll be looking forward to that.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. All right, last but not least, we have Osieme Molefe from South Africa talking to us about Ubuntu and its implications for governance in cooperatives. So Osieme, where are you?
I'm over here. Can you see my screen? Can you hear me?
We can hear you well. Yep, excellent. So you have 15 minutes. Go ahead.
My name is Theo Molefe. I wear many hats. I'm a writer, editor, chartered accountant, and I guess now a researcher. This presentation is based on my MPhil research, which I came to based from issues that arose in practice as myself being a coordinating director of a cooperative. I have a lot of ground to cover in a short amount of time, so I'll jump right into it. My starting point for speaking about the implications of Ubuntu for governance in cooperatives is the definition of a cooperative. Ubuntu here being a philosophy practiced across much of the African continent and diaspora, and not the Linux operating system that misappropriated the name. I'll be working with the definition of a cooperative that we all know and love from the statement on the cooperative identity, which is that a cooperative is an autonomous association of persons united voluntarily to meet their common economic, social, and cultural needs and aspirations through a jointly owned and democratically controlled enterprise. There are other definitions, but none are materially different enough for the purposes of my presentation today. I'm using the statements definition because it's the one embedded in ILO recommendation 193, an international instrument that has guided ILO member states, particularly member states in Africa and elsewhere, on the development of laws and policies on cooperatives, replacing the previous ILO recommendation that applies specifically to inverted commas, developing countries. What many countries in Africa and elsewhere in non-European contexts have in common is a shared experience of coloniality, which Maldonado Torres defines as long-standing patterns of power that emerge as a result of colonialism, but that define culture, labor, insubjective relations, and knowledge production well beyond the strict limits of colonial administrations. They have a shared experience specifically of epistemic coloniality, which Mbembe describes as the endless production of theories based on European traditions. And epistemic coloniality is a wider context in which I've come to consider the implications of Ubuntu for governance in cooperatives. The philosophy finds itself today, even on the continent where it's widely subscribed to and practiced, not so much on the margins, but theorized and perhaps over-theorized in the academy, often in ways abstracted from its lived practice. And also at the same time, it's invisibilized and sometimes even regarded with suspicion in laws and policies in general, let alone laws and policies on cooperatives, so even in international frameworks. In the definition of a cooperative, Ubuntu outlines what a person is in this autonomous association of persons and explicates how they become a person, which is, and I will say it in my language and then translate to English, motu ke motu ka batho ba bangwe. Or in English, a person is a person through or by other people. This is widely recognized to be a founding proposition in the Ubuntu paradigm. The word Ubuntu itself translates to humanness, which is the state of being, the state of being and conditions by which one becomes a person. This is why I'll be using the phrasing being and becoming together. And as you'll see, Ubuntu cannot be reduced to ontology, epistemology, or an ethical value system. It is all three and more. Some scholars argue that Ubuntu is antithetical to humanism, whereas the symposium's conveners say that humanism is one of the three fundamental properties of governance systems. There are others that say Ubuntu is African humanism. But even the addition of the adjective African, where we seldom hear of European humanism, for instance, points to conceptual tensions that I don't have time to get into today, because my focus is on Ubuntu's normative conception of personhood and how it constitutes the person and what that means for the persons that make up a cooperative being an autonomous association of persons. One of the more useful texts I've come across synthesizes the various articulations of Ubuntu and outlines three important levels of its conceptual framework, which is that Ubuntu at the first level describes the empirical fact of the social and biological interdependence of human life. The most commonly cited example here being the mother, father, child triad. At the second level, Ubuntu imparts metaphysical ideas about the interconnectedness of all beings in the universe. And at the third level, it puts forward a normative conception of personhood, which is that being and becoming a good person requires developing harmonious relations with other people and entities in nature, and indeed with nature itself. The converse also applies here. It is this third level, Ubuntu's normative conception of personhood, specifically what makes a person good, that is relevant to cooperatives as being constituted of persons. It makes a clear distinction between desirable and undesirable behaviors, with cooperative behaviors being good and desirable. It also, as I will explain shortly, provides a method by which the purpose, value systems, and norms that engender cooperative behaviors might be devised and revised in the context of the realities of the individuals that constitute the person. What I mean when I say individuals that constitute the person is that despite the grand scale at which it is often discussed, Ubuntu conceptualizes personhood as a lattice of fungible individuals or entities arranged in dyads at the indivisible level, with the idea here being the smallest possible unit of a person or humanity is two individuals. And at the functional level, arranged in triads, for example, the mother, father, child triad, or any other relations in a social unit or autonomous association of persons, which typically scale in triadic fashion, where the addition of each new individual to the group creates new triadic connections among the group. And there's a connection here between not just the present moment, but also the living, dead, and yet to come, speaking to this idea of the intergenerational aspect of cooperation. So in the Ubuntu paradigm, person transcends the individual, and the two are not synonymous, as they seem to be in much of Western thought. As such, a clearer articulation of Ubuntu's foundational proposition could be that an individual is and becomes a person or human through other individuals. So Ubuntu does not deny individuality. It recognizes that the individual is constitutive of the person or enterprise or association, community, society, etc., and that the person, association, enterprise, community, society, etc., is the mechanism by which the individual survives and thrives. Now, this raises a few questions, such as how exactly does one go about developing harmonious relations with others? Who are these others? Are they fixed or indeterminate? Or even, how do these harmonious relations look? This last question is probably the easiest, which is why there have been many suggestions of what it looks like. Take, for example, this famous one by Archbishop Emeritus Desmond Tutu, who said, "A person with Ubuntu is open and available to others, affirming of others and does not feel threatened that others are able and good, for he or she has a proper self-assurance that comes from knowing that he or she belongs in a greater whole and is diminished when others are humiliated or diminished, when others are tortured or oppressed, or treated as if they were less than who they are." As a point of comparison, I'll also share what Person and Turnbull, who influenced how this symposium's conveners think about governance in cooperatives, have to say about the humanistic view on harmonious relations, which is that the humanistic paradigm views the individual as a zoon politikon, a relational woman who materializes freedom through human values. Human beings in the humanistic view are guided by universally applicable principles and aim at long-term relationships. They are intrinsically motivated to self-actualize and serve humanity through what they do. They do not have fixed or preconceived utility functions, but their interests, needs, and wants take shape through discourse and continuous exchange with the outside world. The two descriptions are strikingly similar, and I don't know about you, but I find that exciting. It suggests to me a convergence of thought on the nature of being a human being, or at least a good human being. My concern, however, is that both descriptions, in addition to being unnecessarily gendered, overemphasize the individual as a site of analysis. And I suspect there's a lot being lost in Tutu's translation, and he alludes to that. He alludes to that too in the passage from which that quote is taken. Because Ubuntu's site of analysis is not the individual, but the person or association, enterprise, community, society, etc., as being constituted of individuals. In focusing on the person, association, enterprise, community, society, etc., of which individuals are constitutive, the Ubuntu paradigm allows us to, firstly, better map the human networks, or what Tutu calls the greater whole, a person and Turnbull, the outside world, plus the relational woman that sustain us and of which we as individuals are constitutive. It also provides an ethical framework that allows us to see assess which aspects of these human networks are desirable and which are not. Again, with harmony, the harmonious aspects being desirable and the disharmonious not. And importantly, in allowing us to map our greater whole, Ubuntu also allows us to see the others with whom we should engage in discourse on our shared human condition to divine our collective purpose, value system, and norms through which we define and meet our collective needs and aspirations. This is the being and becoming I spoke of earlier. So in addition to all the other things that it is, Ubuntu is also a framework for discourse for individuals that constitute a person, association, enterprise, community, society, etc., to determine and revise and evolve their purpose, values, and norms through which they meet their needs and aspirations. In the Ubuntu paradigm, none of these are predetermined, nor is there a universally applicable set. Rather, they emerge in what Ramose calls the ceaseless unfolding of the individuals that constitute the person, association, enterprise, community, society, etc., in relation to each other. It is through this endless determination and redetermination of purpose, values, and norms, and embodying them, that the individuals that constitute a person or association, enterprise, community, society, etc., are and become human and fulfill their needs and aspirations. It's an indeterminable convergence of the moral in the sense of purpose, values, and norms, and the material in the sense of needs and aspirations. And I can't think of a better way to describe this process of being and becoming other than trans-individual actualization. And it's indeterminable because in an increasingly networked world of highly mobile, interdependent individuals, the contours of the larger whole in which each of us belong changes shape, I imagine, in more dynamic ways than at any point in human history. The implications of this for governance in cooperatives is that it forces us to critically re-examine the idea of who we should consider members, with consequential effects on cooperative governance structures and cooperative typologies. Because a member in the Ubuntu paradigm isn't only, nor should it be only, those who completed a membership form and paid their dues. Members are all individuals in the greater whole, and not in an abstract sense, but in real and measurable terms, however fluid at the edges. This is why I got excited earlier at the northern co-ops, because there's a very similar thing happening here with the concept of trans-individual actualization transgressing the typical cooperative typologies. This process, this trans-individual actualization is quite challenging, but I argue it's also sociologically rich basis for thinking about governance in cooperatives, because it forces us to reconsider the dominant cooperative typologies of European tradition and to think about cooperation as a practice not limited to any one aspect of how we as humans consume, produce, or work, the way of life that transcends them all. It's not, just quickly in conclusion, it's not purely theoretical as I presented it here. It is alive, resonant, and practiced across much of the African continent and diaspora. And I've provided a few texts there that speak about the lived practice. And that it's largely absent from laws, policies for cooperatives on the African continent and international frameworks like Recommendation 193, or the Statement on the Cooperative Identity for that matter, reflects the invisibilizing effects of epistemic coloniality and not the merits of the philosophy. As such, more empirical and theoretical work is needed for the revisibilization of Ubuntu, or what Cornell and Mavungua call the recognition of Ubuntu in laws and policies. It isn't happening at the moment, or not much of it is happening, or it's happening in academic debates removed from lived practice, which is unfortunate. And it'd be one thing if the philosophy had nothing new or unique to offer, but as I hope I've highlighted today, Ubuntu's conception of personhood is a way of seeing and understanding and making and remaking our collective selves in ways that accurately reflects the realities of how we as humans live and exist in relation to each other. And with that, I'll hand back to Sonja.
Thank you so much. This was right on time. So that's fantastic. Thank you. Really appreciate it. We are running a little bit tight, but we're lucky that we've structured it so that we have a discussant who is going to now enlighten us and put it all together for us. And this is Jerome Warren. I'm going to hand the mic to you, Jerome, and you have 10 minutes and then we're done with the session. And I'll just say that at 10 minutes past the hour, we're going to go back to Erin to take us into the next session. So Jerome, I'm giving you the mic.
So thank you very much. And thank you to all the speakers. These were really interesting presentations and talks, and I think really important topics. So I've just been taking notes and just am going to reflect on the things that you've said here. And I think I come from a background in economics, and I think it's interesting to frame this in the context of mainstream economics, or at least to begin with that framework, and then move beyond that. So you have theories like that, those of Huntsman and Williamson, who basically just, sit in their chairs at Harvard and, assume that everyone else is thinking the same way as them, and forget these facts that have been pointed out repeatedly, that, different groups have different needs. So, particularly women or migrants or indigenous groups and others. So there's a variety of needs, as we've heard today. And so on that level, it's inadequate to assume this sort of homogenous, soup of people. And on the other hand, we've talked about cooperatives a lot today, and co-ops are not the same as, a standard corporation. And so you have, fundamentally distinct, differences in design. And so I think about someone like Gregory Dow, who's written on these principles, the asymmetry principle, the imperfection principle, the replication principle. Anyway, it's not my presentation, so those are things I think that are really interesting to sort of crystallize these distinctions. And so what I've also heard today a lot is this sort of an ecosystems view, the focus on process rather than outcomes, a focus on environments and norms, that is being important, sort of paths instead of the nodes, flows instead of stocks. Those are things I'm encountering as well in my research and my readings as well. Perhaps what I would have liked to have seen more as well, and I think what is also important is to focus on the legal framework and the importance, the need to work with governments to design policies that actually do justice to these distinct needs of these groups and these organizations that we've heard about. And I think about a friend of mine, Piero Ammirato, who's written about Italian cooperatives and said that the Italian cooperative policy is a lot more similar to a political program than it is to something you learn in a business school. So that is, I think, an interesting framing. And I think that this type of work, this type of co-creation or agency or whatever you want to call it, can also then in the end work in the long term to undermine these sort of leftovers of the of sort of the master-slave dialectic, talking about differences between North and South and Ubuntu, as we've heard. So wage labor and this notion of neo-abolitionism that we've heard maybe in recent years from people like David Ellerman. So I think there is a need for something like a cooperative economics or social science that is distinct from these sort of static models. People like Eleanor Ostrom, who've written extensively on local resources, shared resources. Although again, as the last speaker has just said, I thought it was really interesting points about the intersubjectivity or the interdependence of personhood. Ostrom comes from this perspective of new institutional economics. So she does go from, this theoretical foundation of these sort of neoclassical scholars. So that is an interesting intervention there. Robert Aumann, who's talked about norm-based rationality. So, the fact that people are in religious groups or, have certain morals does not mean that they're irrational. That it's a different form of rationality. I think there could be a lot of connections made here between things like economic anthropology, people like Karl Polanyi. It's very hot here, that's why I'm sweating. Joe Henrich at Harvard. So Polanyi has written about the substantive economy, which goes beyond exchange, looking at things like reciprocity, relations of reciprocity, sharing, economic sociology. We've heard names like Mark Granovetter today, networks. Robert Putnam and so on. So these are really important ideas. The importance of psychology. I mean, I took, I have a degree in economics, and we never looked inside the black box. What is going on to actually make people, to shape persons to become what they are. Moral education, and not just this notion of behaviorism, nudging. If I put the pizza behind the salad, people would eat more salad. It's the idea of forming a person, and what does that mean? Giving the right context for that, and then maybe returning to another paper of Silvia Sacchetti and Ermanno Tortia, this notion of a public organization. That's not focused internally, but rather that's looking outwards in the world and its relation to others in the world. And I mean, we have pressing crises of climate change and inequality and all these in war and so on. And there is a pressing need to formulate theories that are adequate to describe and talk about these things, and get up from our chairs at Harvard or wherever we are, and look at the world as it is. I guess that's all I had to say.
Thank you so much. Yeah, there was a lot to ponder, and I'm really appreciative of all the speakers today. So we do have a couple of minutes. Thank you for being succinct. We have a few minutes, and I will call on the audience, although there is a lot going on in the chat, and I encourage you to save it and respond to each other, because we are very limited in time to actually talk to each other properly. But any burning questions from anybody in the audience who wants to unmute themselves and say something to any of the speakers, ask or comment. Shy, everybody? No questions? Okay, can I ask the speakers to make some points they think they missed and didn't have time to stress? And I'm thinking, yeah, well, whatever you want to do. Any hands up? Like Chris, do you have anything as the last minute thoughts, or Silvia from what you've seen in the chat?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, you know, it's interesting looking at the evolution of Putnam's work and his most recent book now, The Upswing, where he comes back to this point about the importance of how do we build a sense of ourselves as we, rather than the focus on I. And one of the things that I was most struck by when I first visited Mondragon in 1982 was how culturally the sense of we was in the Basque society. And with globalization and popular culture, that's been diminished. And so a part of me struggles as a sociologist with this question of how do we get back to we, not just because of all the problems we're facing in the United States right now, but as a global society, how do we reinforce the sense of we-ness that is essential to addressing the issues, not just within our cooperatives, but in our world.
Thank you, Chris.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts? Sylvia, you
Yes.
look like you want to say something. Okay.
Yes. Very briefly, thank you, Jerome, for your comments and your chat. I'm not good at replying in chats. I don't know why. It's been like I can't do it. But no, that paper you cite on the public organization is actually pointing out exactly one of the issues that this presentation doesn't touch, which is there are more stakeholders than workers in a cooperative and in organizations in general, and it's important to actually integrate the theory of firms and organizational theory with this idea that we need to understand governance also in terms of its potential to produce external positive effects and reduce negative societal effects. So when we in fact assess governance, yes, we need to consider more than internal costs. We need to look at what exclusion implies in terms of cost for society, and exclusion costs can be very high and overtake essentially the so-called internal efficiency of organizations. So it's important to consider that besides what organizations can do for their own workers, who are of course part of that that consideration of effects that governance can have. And I would tend to conclude by saying that ultimately what I am interested in is to understand how organizations and their governance can make people more vital in terms of being able to shape their own work, their own reality, the reality around them. And I think that is crucial for their self-actualization, but also for other people and future, including future generations.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Well, Eklou has a burning last word.
I just want to share really quickly. First, thank you, Sonja, for moderating the session. And as Chris, in terms of our paper, as Chris and I delve into this issue of governance and shared services, we found that this area needs a lot of research along the line of communication, decision making, and policies, etc. So I would invite scholars to delve into this area of governance under the umbrella of shared services as well. So okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, everybody. We really appreciate your contributions.